these stairs here at Church of the Covenant, it's apparent to all who stand here that they are not standing on just stairs, but on shoulders of giants. And I'm so deeply grateful that Reverend Alice Hageman is one of those giants in this church, pastoral giant as a pastor of this place. I also want to name, if it's not yet apparent to you due to your bulletin or your eyes, Reverend Merlin Southwick is also a former pastor of this place and very much a part of this community still. Reverend Liz Rice is also, who has just read our scripture, a former pastor of this place. And Mick Comstock is also with us this morning, a former pastor of this place, in addition to, of course, Reverend Rosie Olmsted. Friends, there are giants among us, and you probably did not even know that because of their humility and their sense of call. We give great thanks to God for all the shoulders that we all stand on. In that spirit, would you pray with me? Holy and loving God, take our lips and speak with them. Take our minds and think with them. Take our hands and work with them. And take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you and all of creation. Amen. When I sat down to get arrested a week ago Wednesday, I noticed something I likely would not have seen before. Diggers. I think the proper word is backhoe. Of course, such an opening line from a sermon requires a little background. I am humbled to have taken part in perhaps Boston's largest interfaith clergy civil disobedience for climate justice, opposing the installation of a fracked gas pipeline through a community here in Boston, in Roxbury, that nobody wants. More information about this action and the growing movement for climate justice is found in this week's Covenant News. Thank you, Evelyn Kimber, for lovingly getting that out so beautifully every month. But why notice a digger? Thank you, Rowan Alexander Mark, the 2-year-old son that we do our best to steward these days in our home. This boy notices things. His perception at times is unreal. Dada, crescent moon. Dada, green light. Dada, no garbage bins today because a Monday holiday. Yes, this intense perception of a child has caused my own eyes to look out in new directions these days. So when I sat down with feet dangling over that pipeline, the very first thing that I noticed were the digger backhoes poised on that street. And of course, I smiled thinking about him and how I am called to steward him and the earth that he is inheriting. But it also caused me to pray for those gifted and loving workers who sit behind those diggers on a daily basis. And the prayer was that their skills would continue to be used in our new emerging alternative energy economy. Our 2 scripture readings this morning speak about the importance of perspective. In our gospel reading from Luke, a story unique to Luke in all the gospel accounts, the miraculous raising to life of this widow's only child begins with the power of perception. Jesus sees her. The text seems to go out of its way to make this clear. Following his famous so-called Sermon on the Plains, Jesus and his friends go to Capernaum, and we last heard about last week, and encounter that Roman centurion and heals his servant. And in today's reading, his group travels on toward that town called Nain, a small Galilean off the distant path, kind of a town just a few miles from where Jesus grew up. And as they approach the village's gate, they encounter a funeral procession, dark veils and many tears. We follow the narrative arc of this gospel story and notice how the gaze of Jesus looks past the funeral focal point of the casket and the large crowd and zones in on the tear-filled eyes of a mother. And he sees her. He sees that she is now not only one of those unique, broken-hearted people for whom the very heart of God grieves in solidarity, those parents who have lost a child. But he also sees that she has lost a partner. She is a widow. She is bereft of companionship, which means she is bereft of financial support. And she is on the edge of extreme poverty. Fresh in Jesus' followers' minds are the words he recently preached on those Galilean plains. Blessed are the poor. Jesus sees the widow, but she does not see him. Unlike other stories of healing in the Gospels, the person who is most in need does not seek out Jesus. She does not ask for anything. She simply grieves, and Jesus simply sees. In this story rises the profound gospel truth that in grief is God. In grief is God. Blessed are you who mourn and weep. These words, also fresh on the disciples' minds, should also always be fresh on ours. God sees those who mourn, and God grieves. When Jesus sees the grief of this widow, he is filled with compassion. That Greek word used to translate here as to suffer with, from the pit of the stomach, or more specifically, to be moved from the gut. We recall that for the ancients, the gut was the seat of emotions like love and sympathy, and Jesus internalizes her pain in a very real, embodied way. This past week, I have found my gut hurting with grief over someone I have never met. Last week in worship, we prayed for Nancy and Christine and their colleague, Bill Roberts, and his spouse, who tragically lost their 4-year-old son in a random accident. Even speaking about such a story makes my stomach turn. For as a father of a toddler, I can't fathom the pain, the devastation of his parents, and especially with the raging thoughts that I'm sure accompany such a loss of unjustified self-condemnation, I could have prevented this. Oh, that we had the power of Jesus, who could restore life and raise this toddler back to life. Any of us would do it in an instant. My prayer has been and continues to be a big one, that this family would experience a miracle where they sense and feel the Spirit's presence even in these darkest, painful days. Compassion can stop us in the middle of our week. And of course, there are many stories like this that you all know more intimately, and never are there answers that are easy when faced with grief. Compassion can stop us, but it can also call us to send cards, to show up even without words, to hold, to accompany, to pray. Compassion can call us to reach out. At that gate of Nain, the pain in Jesus' gut causes him to literally reach out, and he touches the casket. Notice in doing so, he is breaking one of the ritual purity laws of his own faith. And in order to be allowed back into a place of worship, Jesus would then have had to endure a lengthy purification process. This reaching out is a reaching out to inconvenience. Out of compassion, Jesus breaks down tradition and convenience and offers new life. In this touch, the Son breathes again. One of our spiritual practices as people of the good book is to see ourselves in the very stories that come handed down to us week by week, generation to generation. And so in today's gospel reading, we are first invited to see ourselves as the widow, as the one who knows loss, pain, and grief. Many of us don't need to imagine how hard that is to be the widow. We are there now, we have been there, and we will be there. But in such a step, we are also to envision the gaze of Jesus, the loving, compassionate presence of God coming to us, especially in loss. We are also then invited to see ourselves in the very role of Jesus. We are called to the way of perception, the way of truly seeing others, the way of joining them in their full humanity. This theme of perception is one that courses throughout the entire gospel of Luke and lands at the very heart of our faith's message. And finally, we are called to place ourselves in the body of the Son in this story. The question is, do we see ourselves at the beginning of the story, where the casket is closed before the Son is raised by Jesus, or after the casket door is flung wide open and restoration of life is happening? How we see ourselves as people of faith matters. Are we living into false identities of inadequacy that tell us that we are not good enough, not faithful enough, not loved enough, not useful enough? These are, of course, heresies. For in our faith life, such lies belong in the casket. How we see ourselves as a faith community also matters. Do we see ourselves as a vibrant and spirit-infused community, or as part of the infamous, if not hackneyed, mainline decline? Do we see ourselves as our sisters and brothers from Nicaragua see us? You may have noted they shared a letter with a graphic depiction of our connection and how they see us this past week, and the words trust, communication, love, the struggle, unity is how they described our partnership. Do we see ourselves as an essential part of the now growing Boston Warm 2 movement? This past week, we joined leaders of some 27 faith communities and nonprofits, sitting side by side with City of Boston officials, thanks be to God, finally, dedicating ourselves to a shared goal of ending chronic homelessness here in Boston by 2018. Miraculous commitment, very possible. Look forward to more details of how we can practically take part in that city and faith partnership here in Boston. And do we see ourselves as GBIO sees us? Over a week ago, some 1/4 of this community gathered with some 900 folks at Old South, gathered in an interfaith rally to garner support for important criminal justice reform and affordable housing solutions. Our own city councilor, Tito Jackson, told this gathered faith community, "Faith without works is dead. I need you all to act." Do we see ourselves as people of faith that God is using to bring about more peace, not only in our city, but in our world? How we see ourselves makes all the difference, and it has ripple effects. This story of the raising at Nain is one that John the Baptist is given evidence of the reality of Jesus being Messiah, Jesus the one of peace. His followers ask Jesus' followers, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" This text happens just after our reading this morning. And Jesus answers, "Go and tell John the Baptist what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them." In these acts of compassion, in the raising at Nain, these followers of John, just as the followers of Jesus, are re-inspired to be the prophetic voice pointing to the one of peace in the world. In today's epistle reading from Galatians, Paul recognizes who he truly is, and he makes a very honest self-assessment. "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it." Paul is very honest about his past, but he's also very clear about his identity in the present. "But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through grace, was pleased to reveal God's child to me so that I may proclaim Christ among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem, but I went away at once to Arabia, to the regions of Syria." Paul perceives that he has a real calling. He has something to do in the world, that he is deeply valued despite his horrific past of violence. He sees that he has a role to play to be part of the good news for all of creation. And I love that he not only begins this journey immediately, but he goes away for 3 years. He takes a contemplative journey into the Arabian Peninsula, into Syria, as is described in our text. We often think of Paul's conversion as a one-time event on that Damascus road where he sees and is blinded by the light, but this story gives a little more nuance, gives him a sense of figuring out who he is in relation to God, gives this idea of retreat and reflection upon who God is calling us to be. Our faith requires such retreats at times. When we have questions about who we are, when we are faced with self-doubt, and questions about God's role in our world, I encourage us to find in community such retreats, such escapes into the wildness that God has prepared for us so that we can contemplate who we are anew. How do we see ourselves this day, dear friends of Covenant? Do we see ourselves as called and equipped, as people with gifts to share, as people with stories to share, stories that have life-giving qualities? As bearers of nothing short of the gospel, of bearers of God to others. Perhaps we can take a cue from Muhammad Ali and how he saw himself. Clearly someone who rose boldly at a young age to come into his own skin, and even in the face of being stripped of his credentials and careers, to say no to the ways of war, no to the ways of militarism, no to the ways of violence, racism, hatred, yes to the ways of pacifism and peace. Muhammad Ali has inspired a world to work after peace, even as he was crippled and was facing lots of difficulty facing Parkinson's. We are inspired to see ourselves in the light of how he saw himself as someone called and sent and inspired by his own faith. Or closer to home, our own Mary Robinson, in her consistent perspective through prayers and conversation, that those who frequently hang out on our street corners here in Boston are a vital part of our community here inside our building. Mary helps us see that, and we see her, and we are reminded that we need a community to better see ourselves as people of faith. Or to name another one, Joan Hill, in her weekly decision to give of her professional speech therapy skills to accompany Rosie in this past year of her valiant recovery work post-stroke. Joan and Rosie and Mary and so many others are reminding us of the call to serve, the call to compassion, the call to be in community and recover together. So too, our dear friend from New Zealand, Pastor Glenn Cardy, who is leaving tomorrow to head back to New Zealand. He is also with us this morning. 2 weeks ago, he challenged us from an outsider's perspective from New Zealand and said to us, you as a country would be good to replace the word God with compassion in all of your currency and all of your labels. In compassion we trust would be a good suggestion for us. Someone from the outside who is still part of our community, better calling us to our true selves to work after and work toward a world where there is more communion and more compassion. Friends, Paul and Jesus did not work alone. They gathered in community and they ministered within community. So too, we do not go it alone. I'm grateful that a week from today, the Eco Stewards community will gather in Seattle. And one of the things that we will practice together each day is what is called Eco Faith Examine. Something we've come up with is simply a practice off the Christian tradition of examine. And we will ask ourselves at the end of each day, where did you see God today on earth? Where did you see God today on earth? A good practice perhaps for all of us. For this question itself assumes that God is seeable, is perceivable here and now on this earth. If we were to end each day with that, wonder amongst ourselves, what might we be called forward to the next day? How our perception might indeed change. Becky and I were deeply grateful that our 2-year-old got through a needed hernia surgery 2 weeks ago, and we are deeply grateful for your prayers and how much we were held in community and in love. But one of the most anxiety-producing times for us was between when the surgeon came in and told us all went well, and then when the nurse finally came in and told us that Rowan was awake from his anesthesia and ready to be joined in his recovery room. For after the surgeon left, it was a minute or 2 or 5 or 10 or half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour before the nurse came back again, and our blood pressure raised. We knew that Rowan was breathing even under those meds, but in a sense, being under connotes being underwater. There's a sense that the breath has not yet returned. And so when we got that call from the nurse, we raced in and got to see our son, and we're elated to see him not only just breathing, but being distracted by a beautiful piece of apple juice, a box of apple juice, which he had never had before, so he was quite happy. He didn't seem to even miss us. But indeed, friends, that first breath is what we are called not only to be about ourselves, but to perceive in others, to be people who, like Jesus, go and breathe new life into communities, to see ourselves as part of the good news for our world, to see that new breath in others and in creation. We will next sing a great hymn, and the chorus of which is, Jesus lives again, earth can breathe again, pass the word around, loaves abound. This is a call to see anew, to see the world as Jesus sees, that resurrection is a reality. Earth can breathe again, all is joy, nothing is to be taken for granted. And pass the word around. We have a vital story to share with the world, for loaves abound. Abundance is the name of the game, not scarcity. God's presence, not absence, is what we proclaim. Friends, as we sing out together in this service and in our lives, may we, like the earth, breathe again, and with a new sense of ourselves as deeply loved by God, and filled with gifts to give and good news stories to tell. May we be led in compassion now and evermore. Amen.